Planet Earth is now home to 6 billion people. In science fiction, we can all escape into space. But in science fact, that's not yet an option. So despite its flights of fantasy, sci-fi's theme has always been our human relationships here and now. Will the couple of the future look like this, this, or even this? Will life in the city become an overcrowded nightmare? Will Mars be the answer to our struggle for survival on Earth? In our fast-changing world, science fiction can warn of a coming dystopia, or offer a glimpse of utopia. Within popular culture, science fiction projects a vivid picture of our future. Rather than predictions, it produces simulations of how society might look and work. One of today's most successful sci-fi visionaries is writer Kim Stanley Robinson.
Science fiction is a tool for thinking about the future and where we might go. And for, I think, a couple hundred years now, humanity has thought of its history as something that can be shaped and pushed. And so science fiction is one of the tools that the way that we think about it. Almost all science fiction, I think, has this visionary or social aspect in it.
Because it entertains, that vision sometimes lacks the formality of more conservative storytelling. But its impact on contemporary mores can be just as effective. Despite the seduction of futuristic technology, our future depends on our relationships with each other. In the brave new world of the Forbidden Planet, everything is bright and new.
Come on in.
Didn't bring my bathing suit.
What's a bathing suit?
Oh, murder.
Except the role of men and women, which is safely locked in the past. At the climax to the film, Altera, the poor, defenseless heroine, is chased by the monster of the id. She's clearly seen in the long, dramatic tradition of the innocent maiden in a wicked world. The cultural message is clear. Even in this distant galaxy, a woman's place is firmly in a man's arms. Science fiction has fueled the sexist conspiracy that suggests that the machines of the future are strictly for men only.
And believe me, this is the hottest crew I've ever worked with, especially in the brains department.
Yeah, very attractive, too.
Yeah, I agree. But, and you can quote me on this, unless you look like a test tube or a chemical formula, you haven't got a chance.
From the woman's angle, Dr. Van Horn, how does it feel making a trip like this alone with 4 men?
The sentiment was straight 1950s Hollywood. Even in space, the brains department is still going to be a sex object. That most phallic of all machines, the rocket, symbolized the gulf between male expectations and conventional female limitations. There's only one relationship the Doctor of Chemistry can expect, and it isn't a professional one.
Now, don't get mad at me. But can't you ever relax? All these weeks, months, I've been watching you. Nothing but work, work, work. Well, I've been wondering, how does a girl like you get mixed up in a thing like this in the first place?
I suppose you think that women should only cook and sew and bear children?
Isn't that enough?
It was always the male bosses who controlled the new technology.
What a beauty!
By golly, I think I'll buy a new car. Say, Millie, how long have I had the old one?
1 year, 8 months, 14 days, 11 minutes, 43 seconds. 3 o'clock, boss. Time to go home.
As well as a car, ideally the technology of the future would produce the perfect woman. It's no surprise that science fiction has been a release for male fantasies. In a future imagined primarily by male writers, artists and filmmakers, and read or watched predominantly by men, attitudes to women have frequently been stunted at the level of adolescent daydream. Damsels in distress have always needed heroes to save the day. Buster Crabbe's Flash Gordon was the classic champion. The series reinforced every negative female stereotype. Other films of the time did the same, but they didn't pretend to be looking into the future. And when it all gets too much, the girls can just...
Good many dramatic situations begin with screaming.
Sci-fi women have always been prone to unwelcome advances from passing monsters. The threat of alien abduction echoed an older fear of the invader coming to rape and pillage. Even if it sometimes looked like the robot monster was more in distress than the damsel he was chasing. Whatever the threat, it was clear that a man was not a man if he couldn't protect his girl from the clutches of the bug-eyed monster. While sci-fi imagination was in fast forward, relationships between men and women went into reverse.
Remove the Earth Woman. Prepare her for our pleasure.
Don't kill him yet, Father. I want him.
A 1980 Flash Gordon still strutted his stuff.
Go, Flash, go!
And the girls still cheered. But sexual mores had moved on, and Flash had become attractive to some of the boys as well. One of the great advantages of sci-fi is the excuse to dress people in outlandish clothes.
An object the like of which we had never seen before. A frightening, strange shape descending with relentless purpose.
A woman in tight-fitting black leather might cause a stir in most films.
It's an aircraft, all right, but like nothing I've ever seen before. Hello! What do you mean? Hello, hello.
For a devil girl from Mars, the style was de rigueur.
Mars herself.
Get back or I'll fire.
Not surprisingly, she dominates the film. Voyeurism dressed as futurism. If you manage to escape the B-movie Astronavigatrix, you might luck into the ultimate trip to a planet where Zsa Zsa Gabor queens it over a world of gorgeous Amazons.
Is this a dead planet?
Landing on an unknown planet, they are captured by long-limbed beauties. When they say, "Take me to your leader," and they take them to a creature like this, you know they're on planet Venus.
We're the only men on the whole planet?
Yes.
Wow.
Even when a Wonder Woman gets in on the sci-fi action, she's still performing her death-defying acts in a swimsuit. Sultry secretary by day, super Amazon by night, she's under constant pressure to give it all up and get married. The power of the female form is still a potent weapon. Sex sells. In his early sci-fi classic, Metropolis, German director Fritz Lang explored a woman's seductiveness as perceived by men. The woman is an android, the creation of a mad professor, but her fascination is real. The men in the story were entranced, so were the men in the audience. In this Japanese manga vision of the far future, the female android is still the victim, still fighting a losing battle against a male-dominated, mechanized world. just like many modern computer games. The technology has changed. The role of the woman as victim is the same. But there was some hope for women. The struggle to allow them to share equally in the achievements of the future started as early as 1929, when Lang first sent a woman into space. Despite being dressed for 18 holes of golf at St Andrews, the female astronaut is celebrated as a heroine in her own right. Her colleagues on board a rocket to the moon accept her as an equal. But once on the moon, things don't work out as planned. The adventurers have to return to Earth in a hurry, leaving one of the men behind to survive as best he can. In a last-minute sentimental twist, the woman decides to stand by her man, although Lang seems to suggest that he needs her more than she needs him. At least this couple of the future have achieved some sort of sexual equality, even if their life on the moon looks a little bleak. It took real space travel 34 years to catch up. Valentina Tereshkova, a textile worker and amateur parachutist, was recruited into the Soviet cosmonaut program in the early 60s. She became the first woman in space. Yuri Gagarin had already scored a worldwide propaganda success for the Russians by being the first man in space. So, with Tereshkova, the Russians were accused of simply staging yet another publicity stunt. But despite the geopolitical backbiting, it was still a significant crack in the traditional glass ceiling in the sky. The times, they were a-changin'. In the 1960s, the future seemed to lie in a radical challenge to tradition. Equality for all, in the happy hippie days of love-ins and rock and roll. The times brought more than the pill in sexual liberation. The demand for a change in the balance between the sexes also required a different type of science fiction, written by women, such as award-winning author Marge Piercy.
We loved a whole lot of things about science fiction, but we wanted it to be ours. We wanted it to reflect, we wanted there to be human women, even if they were called something else, in it, with our own concerns. We didn't want to be props or prizes. We wanted to be active.
From its early days, Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek set out to break the traditional mold, with Lieutenant Uhura, an African-American woman, on the flight deck. Roddenberry frequently had to fight with program executives to keep her on board, but as Star Trek evolved, she took on more responsibility and became a powerful symbol of change to other sci-fi writers.
One of the things that was terribly important for me about that sort of science fiction when I was a teenager is that I was growing up in what was in effect pre-apartheid Virginia.
To many, a black woman in space produced a genuine change in cultural perception.
I think the thing that Gene Roddenberry gave us there is this wonderful kind of ethical fiction, and a lot of what Star Trek is about it's about cultural diversity.
Uhura was an inspiration to Dr. Mae Jemison, the first African-American woman in space, who blasted into orbit on the space shuttle Endeavour. Dr. Jemison later repaid her debt by playing a guest role in an episode of Star Trek. By the time the Empire struck back, Princess Leia was still the inspiration for screen gallantry, but she was in charge, briefing the troops before the battle.
The energy shield can only be opened for a short time, so you'll have to stay very close to your transports.
2 fighters against a Star Destroyer?
The ion cannon will fire several shots to make sure that any enemy ships will be out of your flight path. When you've gotten past the energy shield, proceed directly to the rendezvous point. Understood?
Yeah.
Good luck.
Science fiction doesn't offer an opportunity to explore sex roles really any more than contemporary stories about contemporary life, but it enables you to change the variables more extremely, so you can look at more played out situations than people are apt to believe.
The Stepford Wives become male fantasies of the ideal woman. Was a woman's place in the future still in the kitchen?
I mean, you never even used to clean your kitchen, much less wear makeup.
Admit it, Joanna. That was a joke. Dave works hard all day long, and what does he come home to? A slob.
The film turned the spotlight on traditional male attitudes to women.
I just want to look like a woman.
An obsession with cleaning, cooking and looking pretty for their menfolk seems to have overtaken the women of Stepford.
Right, you take it black.
Do you bleed?
Why, look at your hand.
These perfect housekeepers are not what they seem. The real women are dead, replaced by look-alike robots.
You explore the future because you want to say, if we, well, what is it they say, that all science fiction is divided into what if only, and if this goes on. Well, so that's really what you're talking about. If we continue doing what we're doing, or if we don't do what we should be doing, or if only we would learn to do differently, what kind of world would we live in?
1970s sci-fi comics also began showing women not merely as victims, but as heroines in their own right. These warrior women still seemed happiest fighting in luscious-looking lingerie, but at least they usually came out on top. With Ripley in Alien, Hollywood produced a genuine sci-fi heroine capable of outwitting man and beast. On TV, Lieutenant Commander Ivanova stamps her authority on the cult series Babylon 5. And in Star Trek, Commander Janeway is clearly in charge of the starship Voyager. In Terminator 2, the ordinary woman strikes a blow for equality. The sci-fi world in which both heroes and heroines now live has become disturbingly violent. But how men and women relate to each other is only part of the equation. For science fiction, predicting the society of the future is a whole new challenge.
If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
By depicting a dystopian or nightmare future, science fiction provides a sober warning for all of us. This century's most powerful portrait of an individual struggling against oppression was written by George Orwell. In 1984, society is controlled by totalitarian superpowers. Absolute power is in the hands of Big Brother. Orwell's disturbing vision of the future was written in 1948. The book was a distillation of his fears about the way society in the 20th century was evolving. His own personal experience working for the BBC in London during World War II had shown him the effectiveness of censorship. Orwell dreaded state propaganda becoming a form of national brainwashing. Events of the time seemed to support his paranoia. During the Third Reich, Hitler's domination of Germany demonstrated the evils of absolute political power. Through the military, he controlled every aspect of daily life. And in the Soviet Union of the late 1940s, Stalin's tyrannical regime crushed all opposition. Orwell's hero, Winston Smith, works in the Ministry of Truth, really the Ministry of Lies. The English language is newspeak. Words like justice and democracy no longer exist. The past is rewritten every day to suit the political convenience of the present. Orwell sets out a grim warning about the power of the state to control our lives.
all the memorable science fiction writing really is about the state of where we are and where we might be going. They're like warning shots across the bow of society, saying, watch out, you're going this way.
Freedom is the freedom to say 2 + 2 = 4.
Freedom to speak the truth is always at risk, particularly under totalitarian regimes. One of the first investigative journalists in the Soviet Union, Vitaly Vitaliev, first read a black market copy of Orwell's book in the early 1980s.
When I first got hold of his book 1984, and this book was very strictly banned in the Soviet Union, much more than books by Solzhenitsyn, I was literally stunned. I was close to tears. I remember I was reading it overnight because next morning I had to pass it on to someone else, and it was in English. And I just, well, I didn't know anything about George Orwell, and I couldn't believe that someone, you know, from a foreign country could have such a powerful, although slightly grotesque, but still incredibly powerful vision of our lives.
You asked me once, Winston, what was in room 101. I told you that you knew already. Everyone knows. The thing that is in room 101 is the worst thing in the world.
1984 was banned in the Soviet Union, but Vitaliev discovered that senior members of the Communist Party had their own copies of a carefully translated limited edition.
So the book that was banned for the population, so to say, that's how they used to refer to us, was actually quite accessible for the elite. And I suspected immediately that they were probably using it as a manual of their power, because it basically describes the whole mechanism of a totalitarian power.
In your case, it is rats.
Please, what do you want me to do?
The answer, of course, is to love Big Brother. With today's obsession with surveillance, Big Brother is everywhere. On average, someone living and working in a modern city is caught on a security camera 25 times a day, raising Orwellian questions about the civil liberties of the individual. But as well as them watching us, we watch them.
Yeah, the individual v society problem is always concerns me, because, you know, we are so inundated by imagery, ideas from television, everything from advertising, and to try to maintain your individuality, I think, is very difficult.
We are constantly being told what we should be doing, buying, eating, or drinking. Many believe the hard-hitting persuaders in the media are only a corporate version of Big Brother.
I remember I left America in '67 because walking down the beach at Santa Monica, and the sun was setting and the gulls were flying and the waves were lapping and a beautiful girl by my side, and I was in love, I was happy, but, or was I? Had I been told I should be in love and happy because I'd seen it in a soap commercial?
In this age of mass communication, freedom means freedom to think, challenge, and even be unhappy. The key, as Orwell predicted, is information. If the past and its literature could be rewritten or destroyed, control would be total. Ray Bradbury's novel Fahrenheit 451 explored the theme. Individuality is under attack in a future world policed by firemen. In a surreal role reversal, their mission is to burn all books. Fahrenheit 451 is supposedly the temperature at which books and their subversive contents go up in flames.
There's no need for that. I said the books won't die.
Books only survived if committed to memory by dissidents.
Novels aren't life. What did Montag hope to get out of all this print? Happiness? What a poor idiot you must have been.
Ray Bradbury's notion of a totalitarian society where each individual memorized one banned book, and basically the a whole country became like one huge sort of living and walking library. I think it's a very interesting observation, because again I did know people who had to learn the banned books by heart, and Solzhenitsyn actually in one of his autobiographical novels he writes about how he had literally to memorize some of his short stories, you know, from the first word to the last, to avoid censorship.
Most of us have so far escaped Bradbury's dystopia, but today's accelerating rate of change has transformed yesterday's dreams, and even its nightmares, into a weird reality. The population of planet Earth is increasing by 250,000 people every day. 3 billion and growing live in the world's overcrowded cities. Keeping pace with this constant mutation is a daily activity.
Just coming to terms even with the present is a science fiction act. And my feeling is that we are now living in a science fiction novel that we are all writing together as a community. And so there's no escaping science fiction, because now we live in it, inside it.
The modern city is science fiction in steel, glass, carbon fiber, and titanium. The urban environment is a laboratory where science fiction, architecture, and design inspire each other to experiment on us. Most of us live and work in towns, so naturally, the way they develop is central to many sci-fi visions. Will the future be an urban nightmare or a high-tech paradise? In 1920s America, the future was unavoidable. Fritz Lang's image of a future city was inspired by the gigantic constructions he saw in New York City. But his sci-fi city was more than an architectural dream. It was a powerful comment on the world being created by modern capitalism. Deep below the surface of the city, the oppressed masses go through their daily grind, providing wealth and luxury to the elite living in the towers above. In showing that urban life could be alienating, lonely, and dangerous, Lang reflected people's fears about the modern city. But the future was not all dark. For Frank R. Paul, one of the great artists of science fiction, the city was a showplace for technology and scientific progress. He turned the covers of pulp magazines into a wonderland for young fans of the future. This enthusiasm reflected a fascination for the new and the modern.
Mighty tall buildings in New York City. The Flatiron Building, shaped like a triangle, and the Woolworth Building, 60 stories high, tallest in the world.
In the film Things to Come, the grit and grime of New York City seems strange to the inhabitants of the 21st century. It turns the vision of Metropolis on its head. This underground world is modern, bright, and spacious. Produced in 1936, on the brink of a Second World War, Things to Come showed the brilliant, rational future we could create if we just let science and technology rule our lives. But can reality ever match up to the techno dreams of science fiction?
I think science fiction has liberated our imaginations, perhaps a bit too much, because once you can think the unthinkable, then maybe you begin to imagine you can do the unthinkable. And of course our experience has been that we are doing the unthinkable again and again every day. Some people have become techno-obsessed, they've become nerds about it. In some ways they're going back to the beginning of the 20th century. Science can do everything. Well, it can't do everything, but it can do lots of things, so the techno-obsession will last for a while.
From our viewpoint at the end of the 20th century, we still dream of gleaming cities on the horizon, but they frequently disappear into the smog. The visionaries of the past didn't foresee the consequences of cities laid out for cars. By the 1950s, cars were even promoted using the conventions of science fiction itself. Once again, the woman in this tale of everyday Detroit folk is there merely to add glamour and naive charm. A man was safely at the wheel of destiny.
Firebird 2 to Control Tower. We are about to take off on the highway of tomorrow. Stand by.
This gleaming machine was driving straight out of contemporary sci-fi magazines. But these gas-guzzling fantasy models have left their mark on the modern city. From the sky, cities seem to have been laid out for a dominant life form which runs on wheels and expels poison gas. By the late 1960s, the consequences of a technology-driven world were coming home to roost. Cities were choked with people and pollution. The image now was of the city in crisis. In response, science fiction moved into a new phase, dealing with the gritty issues of everyday life, a world apart from the dream cities of the 30s.
Nothing runs anymore.
An overcrowded New York was the setting for Soylent Green.
Soylent Green has been exhausted.
The vast population is short of food and desperately struggling to survive on a suspicious substitute called Soylent Green. The film was made at a time when the Green movement was just a fringe pressure group. Professor Lawrence Krauss was deeply influenced by the film.
I was a young student at the time I saw Soylent Green, and I remember, for me, it packed an incredible impact. It represented what the potential was of a society where population growth was unchecked, where megacities destroyed the environment around them, and how bad life could really be.
One man discovers the grisly truth about Soylent Green. The remains of the dead are being recycled in the state food factories.
That kind of vision of the future that Soylent Green presents, which is potentially far more pessimistic than the real world, is very important because it does provide that kind of wake-up call, not just for scientists, but for everyone to at least question, are we going in the right direction?
The lesson of BSE, mad cow disease, would seem to be no. In the 80s, sci-fi comics began to reflect the downside of city life. Artists such as Moebius depicted mean, ugly streets. Our once bright future was now full of garbage as people struggled for survival. A violent world demands desperate measures. The magazine 2000 AD introduced Judge Dredd. He dictated law and order in the overpopulated anarchy of Mega City 1. In 1982, Ridley Scott brought the look of the city pioneered by these comic book artists into the mainstream. Blade Runner was a radical departure from past American sci-fi films. Monumental buildings, old and new, dominate the skyline, but they contrast with a grimy vision of life at street level. Urban squalor could blight the future, much as it does the present. The famous Blade Runner look was designed in part by Sid Mead.
We literally took every single architectural style available. You had Byzantine, you had Mayan, you had the 20th century gleaming tower construction, high-rises. You had essentially, you even had aerial traffic, but it was all sort of overlaid like its own sort of archaeological event in progress at all times.
In contrast to earlier, more optimistic visions, this is a disturbing, uncertain world. Writer William Gibson sees the combination of past, present and future as the key to Blade Runner's powerful originality.
It's not an American future. It's very un-American in an interesting way, in that it's a future in which the past is still there, people are living in the retrofitted ruins of the past, which of course is what you do in Europe. It's not a radical concept to the European, but to some part of the American imagination, it's shatteringly new. My God, history is real.
As part of its dark vision, Blade Runner borrowed from contemporary cityscapes in the Far East.
The huge images that were part of the Blade Runner urban landscape, again, were to minimize the human scale. And of course, this is now happening. You go to Shinjuku and Ginza in Tokyo, and you see the same exact idea. There it's done for advertising and visibility and so forth, but dramatically, it diminishes the human on the street.
Blade Runner represents, for me, the example that a highly technological society does not solve social problems. That technology is there to aid our life, but it does not solve the same kind of human problems of greed, fear, hatred that are there and that will always be there.
The urban imagery which inspired Blade Runner's design also influenced William Gibson. He first saw the film when he was writing Neuromancer, a novel which introduced a new place for the sci-fi imagination to visit.
I really did flee the theater the first time I saw a Blade Runner because I was about halfway through the first draft of Neuromancer, and not only was I discovered that this English director was sort of using similar material, but it looked better than the inside of my head.
Password.
Gibson invented the virtual world of cyberspace.
Welcome to BRT Online.
The urban grit and the bright towers of cyberspace are close relations to Blade Runner, but data has replaced the skyscraper as the symbol of the future.
What are you doing?
Making a long-distance phone call. Beijing, a hotel.
Beijing selected.
But if we find cyberspace too complex, the city too dangerous, and life on this planet too oppressive, we can always head towards the new frontier in the sky. Science fiction lets us explore the options for living on other planets, starting a new world. The prospect of living away from planet Earth, somewhere on a distant star, has inspired a host of imaginative speculations. Science fiction knows no limits. You can simply take your favorite city with you and float it off on a lump of rock. You can build a new home for yourself under a dome on a neighboring moon, or set up camp among the other planets in the solar system. The attraction of these off-world colonies is the chance to begin again. New planet, new society, new rules. With a fresh start, we can avoid yesterday's mistakes and today's problems. The nearby planet Mars has long held a particular fascination for both science fiction and real space exploration. Writer Kim Stanley Robinson has written several Mars novels.
Well, what I like about Mars and writing about it is that the planet is really there, and you can see it with the naked eye in the night sky, so that it's not just a theoretical construct or an imaginary place. And you can confirm that with your own senses. And now we've got these satellite pictures of it that show what it's like on the surface, and it's a very amazing world with a lot of geological features that dwarf the equivalent features on Earth, so that if you're interested in mountains and deserts and extreme environments, then Mars is an entire planet of them.
Together with its proximity, the real significance of Mars is the opportunity it gives science fiction to start afresh.
Later, what I liked was the idea that if we did go there, we would really have to start fresh. We'd have to reinvent certain social ways of being so that it's a blank slate socially. And so the combination of the physical beauty and the social possibilities made me want to give it a try.
Ever since 1877, when an Italian astronomer reported seeing canali on Mars, he meant channels, but this was wrongly translated as canals, science fiction has been fascinated by the possibility of life on Mars. If other beings could live there, why not us? By 1910, Edgar Rice Burroughs was beginning his series of adventure stories on Mars. He described kingdoms at war, struggling for survival as the oceans dried up on a dying planet. Acknowledging the influence of science fiction, astronomers have named Martian craters not only after Burroughs, but also Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. Flying to Mars has long been a Hollywood obsession. Contemporary science, however, has been sacrificed for the sake of drama and budget. Despite all available evidence, when rocket ship XM landed, it was raining hard.
Mars extending us a welcome. Now we're prepared to disembark first thing in the morning. In the meantime, we can rest and get our equipment ready.
Well, that's what I've been waiting for. Yeah, I've been itching to get into one of these things.
Sorry to disappoint you, Bill. We have atmosphere here. We won't need pressure suits.
We now know that Mars does have a very thin atmosphere, but it's composed mostly of carbon dioxide, and average temperatures hover around -30 degrees Celsius. These intrepid B-movie explorers in their lightweight jackets are living in blissful ignorance of Martian reality. At least the designers got it right with a rock-covered desert, even if the plot dictated that it was a setting for an ancient alien civilization.
The mind that conceived this must have been of a high order of intelligence, at least the equal of Earth.
Our knowledge about the real planet Mars vastly increased during the Mariner and Viking missions in the 1970s. The spacecraft in orbit around Mars sent a stream of data back to Earth, and the lander finally touched down on the surface of Mars, carrying out detailed chemical and biological analysis on the Martian soil. Thousands of pictures showed the rocky surface of the planet, and atmospheric tests revealed the harsh conditions that any future colonists would need to endure. But the real scientific breakthrough came 2 decades later, in the summer of 1997, when the Pathfinder space probe headed towards Mars. Science and science fiction held their breath. Could this be the beginning of civilization on a new world?
I think I have 8 sets of eyes watching it, and we don't see it.
The world watched with Mission Control. This was a towering technical achievement worthy of any sci-fi story. The day the probe set down, there were 22 million visitors to the Pathfinder website. The date of the landing was also significant, the 4th of July, American Independence Day. Al Gore spoke to the mission leaders and the listening world.
Congratulations to all of you out there on behalf of President Clinton and all of the people of our country. Happy 4th of July, and congratulations on doing an absolutely outstanding job.
The life on Mars debate had taken yet another twist.
There's almost an obsession to want to find life on other planets. It used to be frightening, now it's fascinating. There have been amino acids, living molecules so-called, in meteorites, and there are. It doesn't have to be made by life, but there definitely are. There are supposed to be fossilized bacteria on Mars. Unfortunately, they turned up at a time when NASA was looking for a big increase in its government grant, and they've kind of gone away again. Mars may have life frozen beneath its surface. We don't know.
Total Recall correctly predicts Mars's inhospitable environment, but also anticipates a capitalist chaos. A Martian mining colony established inside a pressurized dome is the setting for a classic sci-fi thriller. Mars is in the middle of a war between a small band of rebels and an evil mine manager. Mars has succumbed to precisely the same economic pressures with the same social results as our world today. After a massive local explosion, the atmosphere is transformed at a stroke, producing instant nirvana. The man and woman of the future can walk off towards a blue rather than red horizon. The idea of Mars being fit for human habitation is, of course, pure fantasy. But 100 years ago, so was the thought of a space probe landing on the very same planet. Neither science nor science fiction ever stands still. In the coming years, the International Space Station, a cooperative venture between Europe, America, and Russia, will take over the work of the Mir space station. Life in space is becoming a reflection of the geopolitics of life on Earth. The issue is a familiar one in science fiction.
As I wrote these Mars novels, I began to realize that any functioning Martian society was going to have to be international and was going to have to reconcile a lot of differences that here on Earth are not being reconciled very well right now. So in this sense, it became another utopian grasp on my part, that we put people from all nations together in a situation where they had to work together, and then they would work together and they would come to accommodate each other's differences. Now that situation already exists on Earth, but it's in such a large scale that people don't quite comprehend it. So if you use Mars as a kind of a microcosm, you can then maybe understand better the situation here.
For science fiction, Mars has become a symbol of mankind's approach to the future. Living there will provide man with a spectacular set of scientific and social challenges. The Martian landscape has canyons running for 2,500 miles, 4 times as deep and 5 times as wide as the Grand Canyon. The view from the top must be stunning. For long-term living, the planet's environment must be dramatically altered. Science fiction has some ideas. With little oxygen available, people would at first need to live under domes in an artificial environment protected from the low pressure and severe cold of the Martian climate. Then, terraforming, as it's known, would take place. It would be like evolution replayed in fast forward. The planet's ice-cold surface would have to be heated up. The density of the atmosphere increased by 100 times, and sufficient oxygen and nitrogen generated to sustain life. The transformation would be spectacular. How to achieve it is another matter. The scientific suggestions look like science fiction. Space mirrors reflecting the sun's rays to heat the planet, or taking ice from passing comets to supply water. All very expensive research in which science fiction plays a part.
Popular culture and what interests people definitely interests funding agencies and affects science. A lot of space station research, for example, or space station activity has been funded by the fact that people are interested in the science fiction associated with going out and exploring the universe.
As the story of the colonization of Mars evolves, the gap between science fiction and science will continue to narrow. Both challenge us to look even further afield for the answers to our problems here on Earth.
What makes science interesting for me is the possibilities of the universe. And that's what drives most scientists that I know. What's possible and what's not. And that's what science fiction is all about. It raises the question of what is possible in the universe. And asking that very question is one of the most enlightening aspects of being a human being. And in that sense, raising the issue of what's possible in the universe, as science fiction does, and being able to even ask that question is one of the greatest contributions that science fiction makes to our society.
In a universe of infinite possibility, science fiction is a good popular guide to our life in the future. While technology is evolving at an exponential pace, society itself, the way we relate to each other and to our natural and political environment, is stuck in the sci-fi slow lane. The way to predict the future is to have the power to shape it. Only one thing is certain: the future's not what it used to be.